Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back through time, far back enough that the lights are dim, the candles are smoking a little too much, and everyone important is related to everyone else. So settle in, loosen your shoulders, let the day go quiet. This evening we're talking about queens, not the glittering, crowned, portrait-ready versions, but the ones who lost. The ones who were politely removed, gently escorted, or unceremoniously locked away. Because history loves a queen, right until it doesn't. When queens fell from power, they rarely fell cleanly. There were no retirement plans, no cozy countryside villas, just a narrow range of options that usually included imprisonment, enforced prayer, strategic forgetting, or a very quiet death that everyone agreed not to talk about too much. And naturally, it was almost always someone else's fault. Let's begin, slowly, with one of history's favorite pastimes: blaming women for political disasters they had no real control over. Imagine being a queen in medieval Europe. You're married off as a teenager to a man you've never met. You exist to produce heirs, smile at banquets, and not embarrass anyone important. If things go well, you're praised for your obedience. If things go badly, you're blamed for the collapse of a dynasty. It's a very relaxing system for everyone else. When a king died, or was overthrown, or simply became inconvenient, the queen's position evaporated almost instantly. Her authority wasn't hers, it was borrowed. And the moment the lender disappeared, the debt came due. Let's drift to England for a moment. They were especially talented at mishandling queens. Consider Isabella of France, wife of Edward II. She was nicknamed the She-Wolf of France, which tells you a lot about how things ended, but not much about how they started. Isabella was married at 12. Edward II, unfortunately, preferred the company of male favorites and seemed largely uninterested in ruling or in Isabella herself. Naturally, this caused political instability, and naturally, when Isabella finally did something about it, everyone was shocked. She raised an army. She invaded England. She deposed her husband. And for a brief, glorious moment, she ruled as regent for her son, which was, of course, completely unacceptable. Once her son, Edward III, grew old enough, Isabella was quietly removed from power. Not violently, that would have been awkward. Instead, she was placed under comfortable house arrest, a polite imprisonment. She lived out her days in relative luxury, but politically erased. A former queen turned background furniture. And that was considered a good outcome. Other queens were not so fortunate. Let's drift eastward toward Scotland, toward Mary, Queen of Scots, a woman whose life reads like a long series of deeply unfortunate decisions, many of which were not hers. Mary became queen as an infant, which is never a great sign. She was raised in France, married into French royalty, widowed young, and returned to Scotland where she was immediately unpopular. She married badly. Then worse. Her husband was murdered. Suspicion followed her like a persistent fog, and before long she was forced to abdicate in favor of her infant son. Mary fled to England seeking protection from her cousin Elizabeth I, which, in hindsight, was optimistic. Instead of protection, Mary received imprisonment for 19 years. 19 years of moving between castles, watched constantly, writing letters, plotting vaguely, and waiting. Elizabeth didn't want to execute her, but she also didn't want her alive, so she did nothing for nearly 2 decades. Eventually, Mary was executed, calmly, formally, with several layers of symbolism and a dress chosen very carefully. It was, by royal standards, tidy. But many queens didn't even get that much ceremony. Let's float south to Spain, to Juana of Castile, better known as Juana la Loca, Juana the Mad. Juana was not mad, or at least not unusually so by royal standards. She was emotional, grief-stricken,
possessive of her husband, who cheated openly. This was interpreted as insanity, conveniently. When her husband died, Juana inherited the throne, which alarmed everyone around her, especially the men who wanted it instead. So she was declared unfit to rule, locked away in a convent palace hybrid, and left there for 46 years, nearly half a century. She outlived her father, her husband, her son, and most of the people who decided she was too unstable to rule. She spent decades alone, wandering drafty halls, occasionally permitted visitors, slowly becoming exactly what they said she was. History called her mad. It rarely mentions the isolation. Now let's drift back north, to France, because France had an exceptional talent for humiliating queens after they lost power. Consider Margaret of Anjou, wife of Henry VI of England. She was fierce, politically capable, and utterly despised for it. During the Wars of the Roses, Margaret led armies. She negotiated alliances. She did the actual work of ruling, while her husband drifted in and out of mental collapse. Naturally, this made her dangerous. When her side lost, Margaret was captured, imprisoned, then ransomed back to France. She lived the rest of her life in relative poverty, a former queen reduced to borrowing money from relatives.
Let's ease back in. Nothing sudden, nothing sharp. If you're just settling deeper into the pillow, that's perfect timing. Because now we're drifting into one of history's favorite quiet obsessions, royal bodies, and what happened when they didn't behave as expected. For queens, the body was never private. It was a public asset, inspected, discussed, blamed. A queen's primary job, once all the poetry and pageantry were stripped away, was to produce heirs, preferably male ones, preferably healthy, preferably on schedule. If she succeeded, she was praised, briefly. If she failed, well, history had a system for that. Let's drift to France again. They kept very detailed grudges. Consider Catherine de' Medici. She's often remembered as a villain, poisoner, manipulator, a woman with a talent for making everything worse. But Catherine began her life as queen in an almost opposite position. She was ignored. Her husband, Henry II, openly adored his mistress, Diane de Poitiers. Catherine spent years failing to produce children, and in royal terms, that was dangerous. For a decade, Catherine lived under the quiet threat of replacement, divorce, exile, or retirement to a convent. She tried everything: pilgrimages, doctors, remedies that bordered on superstition. Eventually, she produced children, 10 of them, which solved one problem and created several others. Most of her sons were sickly, fragile, short-lived, and once her husband died, Catherine's position changed dramatically. She became queen mother, regent, power behind the throne. But history never forgave her early infertility, nor the genetic weakness of her children. Naturally, this was considered her fault. Now let's float eastward again, to the Habsburgs. A family so devoted to keeping power in the family that they eventually became a medical case study. Queens who married into the Habsburg dynasty carried an invisible burden. They were expected to absorb generations of inbreeding and somehow produce strong heirs. Take Maria Ana of Spain, wife of Ferdinand III. She was both his wife and his first cousin, which was not unusual, just unfortunate. Her children suffered from the accumulated genetic damage of centuries of close marriages. Illness, developmental issues, early deaths. When heirs failed to thrive, the blame did not fall on the dynasty's marital choices. Of course not. It fell on the queen. And when queens failed repeatedly, their influence faded. Their households shrank. Their presence at court diminished. They were still queens, technically, but they were treated like reminders of a mistake everyone wanted to forget. Let's drift now to England, because England specialized in blaming queens for everything. Think of Catherine of Aragon, first wife of Henry VIII. She was married young, devout, politically capable. She produced multiple pregnancies. Most ended in stillbirth or infancy. Only one child survived, Mary.
In Henry's mind, this was unacceptable, and clearly it was Catherine's fault.
Never mind that Henry himself might have contributed. That thought did not survive long at court. Catherine was eventually set aside, declared no longer queen, separated from her daughter, moved from residence to residence. She refused to accept her demotion. She continued to sign letters as queen, which irritated everyone immensely. She died alone, still insisting she had been wronged. History, at least, eventually agreed with her. But during her life, her punishment was slow and administrative, titles removed, access restricted, visibility erased. Now let's drift slightly away from Europe, just briefly. In many royal courts across history, queens who failed to produce heirs were not executed or imprisoned. They were simply replaced. New wives, new favorites, new attempts. The discarded queens lived on, sometimes quietly wealthy, sometimes isolated, sometimes forgotten entirely. Their lives became footnotes, repudiated, divorced, sent away, which sounds gentle, but it was permanent. Now let's return to a darker corner of royal life, the accusation of madness. We've already brushed against this with Juana of Castile, but she was far from alone. Queens who expressed grief too loudly, anger too openly, ambition too visibly, these traits were reframed as instability. Take Caroline of Brunswick, wife of George IV of Britain. Their marriage was a disaster almost immediately. They disliked each other intensely. Caroline lived independently, socialized freely, ignored expectations. When George became king, he attempted to divorce her, publicly, messily. She was accused of immoral behavior, her reputation dragged through Parliament. Though she was technically queen, she was excluded from the coronation, locked out of Westminster Abbey. She died shortly after, exhausted, humiliated. Her punishment wasn't imprisonment, it was exposure. And history tends to be harsher to queens who embarrassed men than to those who threatened them. Let's slow down again, let the timeline blur slightly. Another common fate for fallen queens was enforced religion, not out of kindness, but convenience. Convents removed women from politics while preserving appearances. A queen in a convent was no longer dangerous. She was pious, quiet, contained. Some queens adapted, others withered. Records from convents sometimes mention former queens walking the cloisters at night, praying, repeating old titles, holding on to identities no one else acknowledged anymore. And then there were queens who outlived their usefulness entirely, widowed, aged, politically irrelevant. They became queen dowagers, living reminders of past reigns. Some wielded influence, most did not. They watched younger queens replace them, repeat the same mistakes, enter the same traps. History moved on. And finally, there were queens who vanished completely. No dramatic downfall, no execution, no famous imprisonment, just silence. Their names appear once more in records, then never again. They lived, they aged, they died, and no one bothered to write it down. Let's rest here for a moment, among the forgotten women, the discarded bodies, the bloodlines that quietly failed. In the next part, we'll drift into queens who were blamed not just for weak heirs, but for curses, bad luck, and the slow collapse of entire dynasties. For now, breathe slowly. History isn't going anywhere. Let's drift back in. No rush. History has been waiting centuries. It can wait a little longer while you get comfortable again. Tonight, we're moving into a softer kind of blame. Not infertility, not madness, but something far more flexible. Bad luck. Because when kingdoms faltered, crops failed, or heirs died young, someone had to carry the weight of it.
and very often that someone was the queen. Queens were not just wives, they were symbols, walking omens. If things went well, they were praised for their virtue. If things went badly, they were cursed. Let's ease into France again. They were particularly fond of turning women into metaphors. Consider Marie Antoinette. Yes, her. She's remembered for excess, frivolity, and saying things she almost certainly never said. But before the Revolution, before the guillotine, she occupied a different role. She was l'Autrichienne, the Austrian woman. Foreign, suspicious. France was struggling financially. The monarchy was out of touch. The system was collapsing. Naturally, this was blamed on the queen's spending, her dresses, her hair, her existence. Pamphlets portrayed her as corrupt, immoral, a drain on the nation. When the revolution came, she became a symbol of everything wrong with the old world, and symbols are easier to destroy than systems. After the monarchy fell, Marie Antoinette was imprisoned, separated from her children, moved from palace to cell. Her trial was brief, the outcome inevitable. She died quietly, formally, and history remembered her as a curse on France, which was, frankly, a lot for one person to manage. But cursed queens didn't always meet dramatic ends. Sometimes the curse was slower. Let's drift eastward again, to Russia. Consider Alexandra Feodorovna, last Empress of Russia. German-born, deeply religious, devoted to her husband and children. She gave birth to 4 daughters before finally producing a son, which should have secured her position, except her son was ill, very ill. Alexei suffered from hemophilia, a condition passed down through royal bloodlines thanks to generations of intermarriage. This illness dominated Alexandra's life, her anxiety, her decisions. She turned inward, sought spiritual help, trusted the wrong people. At court, she was viewed as cold, unstable, under foreign influence. As Russia slid toward revolution, Alexandra became a lightning rod for resentment. She was blamed for military failures, political chaos, the empire's decline. When the monarchy fell, she was imprisoned alongside her family. Their end was swift and final. History remembered her as unlucky, as if fate itself had followed her into the palace. But fate didn't marry into dynasties. People did. Now let's slow things down, move back a few centuries. In medieval Europe, queens were often blamed for disasters that had nothing to do with them. Plagues, floods, failed harvests. A foreign-born queen was especially vulnerable. She brought strange customs, strange advisors, strange gods sometimes. If the land suffered, it was because she didn't belong. Take Anne of Bohemia, wife of Richard II of England. She was gentle, well-liked by the people. When she died of illness, Richard fell into deep grief, which was considered unkingly. England soon faced unrest, and Anne's death was framed as an omen, as if her presence had been holding something together, her absence a curse. Queens could also be blamed retroactively. Once a dynasty failed, historians looked backward for signs: who married whom, which queen came from which family, where the bloodline went wrong. The fall of a kingdom was never just political, it was personal. Let's drift now to Spain again, because Spain carried its curses carefully. By the time Charles II of Spain was born, the Habsburg dynasty was collapsing under its own genetic weight. He was severely disabled, chronically ill. His mother, Mariana of Austria, served as regent. She was blamed for everything: the kingdom's weakness, its financial troubles, its inability to produce a strong king. Mariana didn't cause these problems, she inherited them. But history prefers a face, and hers was available. When Charles II died without an heir, the Spanish Habsburg line ended, and Mariana's legacy was quietly framed as failure. The curse complete. Now let's drift to another kind of cursed queen, the one whose children died. In a time when infant mortality was common, queens were expected to accept loss gracefully, silently. Those who didn't were labeled unstable,
or unlucky. Repeated deaths suggested something was wrong with her body, her blood, her soul. Some queens lost child after child, stillborn, dead within weeks. They mourned and were watched, because grief in a queen was suspicious. Let's rest for a moment here, among the cradles that never filled, the dynasties that dwindled. Queens were expected to absorb tragedy without consequence, to smile through funerals, to try again, and when they couldn't or wouldn't, they faded, sometimes blamed, sometimes pitied, often both. As we move gently forward, remember this: queens rarely fell because of one mistake. They fell because systems needed someone to carry the blame. In the next part, we'll drift into queens who were removed quietly. No scandal, no execution, just slow erasure. Women who went from center stage to the margins, still alive, still breathing, but no longer important enough to notice. For now, stay still. Let the centuries blur together. The curses can wait a little longer. Let's drift back in again, slowly, carefully. This part of the night belongs to the queens who didn't accept erasure, the ones who resisted the soft exile, who pushed back against the silence. History didn't like them much for that, because while a forgotten queen was safe, a visible one was dangerous. These were women who insisted on being heard, on being seen, on remaining inconvenient. And inconvenience, as we've learned, was rarely forgiven. Let's begin with a familiar figure, one who appears often in lists of difficult women: Empress Matilda of England. Matilda was the daughter of Henry I. She was named his heir, legally, formally, and then Henry died. Naturally, everyone changed their mind. The throne was taken by her cousin, Stephen, and Matilda was expected to accept this, quietly. She did not. Instead, she invaded England, declared herself the rightful ruler, and plunged the country into a civil war known, rather fittingly, as the Anarchy. Matilda came close to being crowned, very close, but she alienated allies, refused to soften her authority, demanded obedience, and in a world that tolerated ruling women only briefly, this was too much. She was forced to retreat, her claim dissolved. But Matilda didn't disappear. She lived on, advised her son, quietly shaped the future. That son became Henry II. History softened toward her after the fact, but during her life she was labeled proud, unpleasant, unfeminine, which was often code for would not comply. Now let's drift to France, to a woman who refused to accept her removal: Joan of Navarre, second wife of Henry IV of England. After Henry's death, Joan found herself vulnerable, foreign, wealthy, and suddenly accused of witchcraft. The charge was thin, convenient. She was imprisoned, her property seized. Joan protested, persistently, and eventually the accusations were dropped. She was released. She lived the rest of her life quietly, but she never stopped defending herself, which made her unusual. Most queens learned quickly that protest made things worse, but not all accepted that lesson. Let's drift east again, toward Russia. Consider Sophia Alexeyevna. She was regent for her younger brothers, effectively ruled Russia, competently. But her authority rested on borrowed time. When Peter the Great grew old enough, he removed her. Not violently. She was sent to a convent. Sophia resisted. She protested. She clung to power. It didn't help. She spent the rest of her life confined, alive, but erased. Her resistance became her legacy, not her governance. Now let's slow down, because resistance didn't always look like armies or uprisings. Sometimes it was quieter. Consider queens who refused to accept divorce, who insisted on their titles. We've already touched on Catherine of Aragon, but her resistance is worth lingering on. She did not leave court quietly. She did not accept the annulment. She wrote letters, appealed to Rome, refused to acknowledge Henry's new marriage. Her stubbornness cost her comfort, access,
her daughter, but it preserved her dignity, and in the long run it preserved her reputation.
Which was a rare victory. Now let's drift to another queen who fought erasure with words, Christina of Sweden. She was crowned young, highly educated, uninterested in marriage, which already made her suspicious. Christina eventually abdicated voluntarily, but on her own terms. She converted religions, left Sweden, reinvented herself. This was deeply unsettling to everyone. She refused to settle into the expected role of retired queen. She traveled, debated philosophers, lived loudly. History didn't quite know what to do with her. She wasn't punished, but she wasn't trusted either. Her refusal to disappear made her an anomaly. Now, let's consider queens who resisted not politically, but emotionally. Queens who mourned publicly, who grieved openly. This was discouraged. Grief suggested weakness, attachment, instability. Yet some queens refused to contain it. They wore mourning longer than expected. They withdrew. They remembered. History often labels these women as melancholic or depressive, but perhaps they were simply unwilling to pretend nothing had happened. And then there were queens who resisted by surviving, by living longer than expected, outlasting enemies, remaining present. Longevity itself became a form of resistance, because as long as they lived, their claims lingered, their titles existed, their memories endured. This made courts uncomfortable. They were watched, managed, contained, but not eliminated. Now, let's pause here, because resistance came at a cost. Queens who fought their removal often paid more than those who accepted it. They lost allies, comfort, safety. They were labeled difficult, dangerous, and history, written largely by their opponents, remembered them accordingly. But without them, the silence would be complete. Let's rest here for a moment. In the next part, we'll drift into the final stage of royal loss, old age, memory, and how queens were remembered or misremembered after death. For now, stay still. Let the resistance soften. Even defiance eventually fades into history's quiet.